Police brutally arrests a homeless woman until a general orders her immediate release. She had barely stepped through the door when the room changed. The chatter dimmed, forks paused midair, and eyes looked everywhere but at her. The woman, dressed in a white cotton dress, clean but clearly worn at the seams, had only one thing in her hand, a folder containing her resume. She took 3 slow steps inside the small diner, hesitating at the front counter where a now hiring sign was taped onto the glass. One of the waitresses looked up, narrowed her eyes, and turned her back with an almost exaggerated motion. The man wiping glasses behind the counter scoffed low and disappeared into the kitchen. The third employee, a young man barely older than a teenager, reached for a Coke bottle on the counter and poured it not into a glass, but deliberately over the edge, splashing it right onto the woman's lap. A cold, syrupy stain spread quickly across the front of her dress. She gasped, more from the shock than the temperature, and instinctively backed away, almost stumbling into a stool behind her. No one said a word. She stood there, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and quiet embarrassment, her hand trembling as she slowly reached down to pick up the folder that had slipped from her fingers. A piece of paper inside fluttered out and landed face down on the floor. No one moved to help. Before we go any further, welcome to Cracks of Light. If you're moved by stories that reveal the beauty buried beneath pain and injustice, if you believe in quiet strength and dignity in the face of cruelty, then this is a place for you. We invite you to subscribe, comment, and share these stories. Your support keeps us telling them, one light in the darkness at a time. Now, back to her. Her name was Evelyn Carter. But in that diner, she wasn't Evelyn. She wasn't anyone. To them, she was just another poor, middle-aged black woman, walking in with nothing but paper dreams and tired shoes. What they didn't know, what none of them cared to ask, was that before she stood in that doorway, she had worked 23 years as a records administrator at County General Hospital. She had worn blouses with buttons and slacks neatly pressed every morning, even when the heater broke in the winter. She was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, who left flowers on coworkers' desks when they lost someone. But life had not remembered her back. Her husband, David, died in a scaffolding collapse 7 years ago. She raised their 2 daughters alone after that, one of whom had since moved across the country, the other still trying to stay clean in a halfway house 3 cities over. Evelyn had managed, until 3 months ago, when budget cuts swept through the hospital and took her job with them. She sold the last of her furniture 2 weeks before this morning. That white dress, the one now stained with Coke, was her only formal wear left. She had hoped the stain wouldn't show in sunlight. The manager finally appeared from the kitchen, a tall woman in her early 40s with a tight ponytail and tighter lips. She didn't ask Evelyn if she needed a napkin. She didn't apologize. She simply pointed one finger toward the exit. Her words came out flat and sharp as broken glass. "We don't hire people like you." Evelyn looked down, not at the stain, not at the folder, just a long, empty stare at the cracked tile under her shoes. She knelt slowly, picked up the folder, and gathered the paper, still trying to keep it from shaking. The air in the diner had turned heavy and still, like before a thunderstorm. And then Evelyn did something no one in the room expected. She smiled, just a small smile, tired, almost invisible. Then she turned and walked out. What no one saw, or rather, what they saw but didn't understand, was the man in the farthest booth. He had been there the whole time, silent, watching. He wore a black suit, not a single wrinkle in sight, and a tie the color of burnt gold. His hands were clean, his coffee untouched. When Evelyn stepped out into the sun, he reached for his phone. But he didn't make a call. He pressed a single button, and a screen lit up, showing the footage from the diner's security camera. He watched it. Again, and again, and then again. The woman who had just walked away, humiliated and rejected, had no idea that her story had already started to turn. That the wheels she thought had rusted still held power. And that this wasn't the end. It was just the very quiet, almost imperceptible beginning of something far greater than she could imagine. Evelyn kept walking, past the diner, past the row of closed-down shops and flickering neon signs. Her shoulders slumped just slightly, not from defeat, but from carrying too many unspoken things. She didn't look back. She had learned a long time ago that looking back never changes what already happened. At the bus stop, she sat down, the folder still clutched against her chest like a shield. People passed her. Some glanced, Some looked away immediately. A child pointed at the stain on her dress and asked his mother something. The mother pulled him away. Evelyn just sat there, still, quiet, waiting for nothing in particular. She used to believe that if you kept your head down and did good, the world would at least leave you alone. But these days, even that felt like a lot to ask for. What none of them knew, what Evelyn had never told anyone, was that she had once helped deliver a baby on a hospital floor when the power went out during a storm. She had held a stranger's hand for 2 hours straight as the woman screamed through contractions in the dark. She never asked for thanks. She never even told her name. She just did what was needed, because that's who she was. Now, she couldn't even get someone to look her in the eye long enough to say, "We're not hiring." And yet, something in her refused to get angry. She was tired, yes. Her heart ached in a place so deep it no longer had words. But anger never got her anywhere. It didn't put food on the table. It didn't protect her daughters when they were young and coughing through winter nights. It didn't soften the look in the landlord's eyes last month when he handed her the eviction notice. So no, she didn't get angry. She just stood up again, wiped her dress with a napkin from her bag, and caught the next bus. Even with the stain on her dress, even with her pride bleeding quietly beneath her ribs, she still believed the day might hold something better than the last. And in a small dark room, several miles away, someone was still watching the security footage. Rewinding, zooming in, not on the spilled drink, not on the waitress's sneer, but on Evelyn's face. Her silence, her dignity. He picked up a pen and wrote something down. The story hadn't ended at the diner door. It had just begun. The bus rattled along cracked city streets as Evelyn sat in the farthest seat, near the back window where she always felt safest. Her reflection stared back at her faintly in the glass. The cola stain had dried into a brown patch across her dress like an ugly memory, but she didn't try to hide it. She just held the folder close and kept her eyes on the blur of buildings passing by. The city moved on as if nothing had happened. People with places to go, voices buzzing into phones, dogs pulling at their leashes, delivery trucks blocking alleys. No one saw her. No one cared to. And yet she sat there as though part of the scenery. Not angry. Not bitter. Just tired. So very tired. The bus driver didn't say a word when she stepped off. She walked another 6 blocks, passing the same liquor store with the broken sign, the same laundromat where she once dried her only coat with quarters borrowed from a stranger, and finally, the shelter. But today, she didn't go in. Instead, she sat on the steps outside, watching the sky shift colors. The day was ending, and with it, maybe another small piece of hope. But she didn't cry. She never did in public. Crying, she believed, was a private act. Like praying or remembering someone you lost. Down the street, a group of boys laughed too loudly. One of them pointed at her. She didn't hear what he said, but the others burst into louder laughter. Evelyn didn't react. She just lowered her eyes, not out of shame, but because she had learned long ago that silence often speaks louder than defiance. The boys moved on. The cold settled in. She pulled the sleeves of her cardigan tighter around her wrists. Her stomach growled quietly, but she ignored it. That had become easier over time. Later that night, she wandered toward the subway station. She liked to walk even when she had nowhere to go. Sometimes the motion itself felt like purpose. Somewhere near the corner of 8th and Harbor, she stopped by a corner store where she used to buy peanut butter crackers when things were better. She looked through the window. The same cashier was inside. A middle-aged man with headphones on and eyes that never once looked up when she walked in years ago. She didn't go inside this time. Just stood there, staring at the racks of cheap snacks, and then kept walking. It wasn't until she reached the underpass that the rain began. It started slow, just a mist. But then it thickened, sharp and cold. She found shelter beneath the bridge, where the ground was dry and the wind less cruel. There were already others there. A man curled up on cardboard, coughing in his sleep. A woman muttering to herself, rocking slowly, arms wrapped tight around a plastic bag like it held everything precious in the world. Evelyn didn't disturb them. She just sat a little distance away, pulled her folder under her coat, and leaned back against the wall. She couldn't remember the last time she'd slept more than 2 hours at a time. The nights came with noises. Sirens, footsteps, angry shouts, and worse. But tonight was quiet. Almost too quiet. And in the stillness, Evelyn let her eyes close. Not in peace, but in surrender. Far across town, That same man in the suit stood by a window in a tall building. His office was dark except for the light of the monitors glowing behind him. On one of the screens, Evelyn's image was paused, her bent over picking up her folder, her face turned just enough to see the line of exhaustion under her eyes. He was still holding the pen he had written with earlier. On the desk beside him lay a file, one that had not come through official channels. It had been sent to him by mistake. Or maybe fate. Inside that file was Evelyn's resume. Creased, worn, and signed with the kind of quiet humility that rarely survives life on the street. He had read it 3 times. Now he read it again. He didn't know her, not yet. But something about the way she had stood there, soaked and humiliated, refusing to lash out or plead, stayed with him. He had seen dozens of applicants today, graduates with polished shoes and LinkedIn profiles. But none of them made him stop. Evelyn had. In the subway tunnel, Evelyn finally dozed off. Her head tilted against the wall, hands still wrapped around the folder as if it were a child needing protection. A police officer on patrol passed the entrance, glanced in, and paused. His partner called out from behind him, but the first officer stepped closer, frowning. Evelyn stirred. She opened her eyes slowly, heart quickening, unsure of what was coming next. The officer said nothing at first, just pointed at her and motioned for her to stand. She obeyed, too tired to protest. He asked for ID. She handed it over. He asked what she was doing there. She said quietly that she was resting, that she wasn't hurting anyone, that it was raining. But the officer wasn't listening. His partner joined him, and together, without raising their voices, they told her to put her hands behind her back. Evelyn didn't understand at first. She asked what for. One of them said she was trespassing. Another said she matched a description. They didn't explain further. The folder fell from her hand as they pulled her arms back. Her dress caught on a piece of metal and tore slightly. She winced, but didn't scream. The other people under the bridge looked away. The woman with the plastic bag clutched it tighter. The coughing man didn't wake up. The officers didn't hit her. But they didn't treat her gently, either. She was pushed against the wall. Cold steel touched her wrists. Her breathing grew shallow. Her eyes blurred. This wasn't the first time. But something about this moment felt like too much. As if whatever small thread she'd been holding on to had finally frayed beyond saving. They dragged her toward the cruiser. She didn't fight. She didn't say anything. Back in the tall building, the man in the suit heard a tone on his desk phone. A direct line. He answered. The voice on the other end was hurried. It mentioned a woman. An arrest. A misunderstanding. The man's brows furrowed. He asked for the name. When he heard it, his eyes narrowed. He pressed another button. Security footage filled his screen again. He watched her being pulled away. Watched her face as it tried not to break. He stood up slowly. Walked to the other side of the room. Picked up a phone not connected to his desk. Then he gave a single, quiet order. Find her. And let her go. Now. Evelyn sat in the back of the police cruiser, her wrists still raw from the tightness of the cuffs. Her body rocked with every bump in the road, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes were fixed on the rain streaking across the window, each drop leaving a trail like a memory sliding down and disappearing. The silence in the car was thick, broken only by the crackle of the radio and the occasional cough from the officer in the front passenger seat. Neither man looked back at her. Neither said a word that felt human. It was as if she wasn't a person anymore. Just a task. An inconvenience in a night already too long. The cruiser pulled into the precinct. They led her inside without speaking. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. At the booking desk, a younger officer looked up as they brought her forward. He glanced at her name, then at her dress, now torn and wet. Something in his face shifted for a second, maybe doubt or discomfort, but he said nothing. The form was filled quickly. Evelyn gave her name, her age, the last address she remembered before being evicted. When asked if she had a phone number, she said no. When asked for emergency contact, she shook her head. They placed her in a holding cell. Cold concrete walls, a bench bolted to the floor, a toilet in the corner. No clock, no blanket, no explanation of what came next. Evelyn sat down slowly, folded her hands in her lap, and stared at her feet. She was too tired to cry, too numb to panic. Somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief, she just sat. Time passed in a way that didn't feel like time. No one came. No one said her name. Hours might have gone by. Or maybe just minutes. Evelyn didn't know. At one point, a young female officer walked past the cell. She glanced in briefly, met Evelyn's eyes, and then kept walking. It wasn't hostility, just indifference. That was almost worse. Indifference made you invisible. In the corner of the room, something dripped. Tap, tap, tap. It was the only sound for what felt like forever. Evelyn closed her eyes. For a moment, she wasn't in a cell. She was back in her kitchen before David died, humming to herself while stirring oatmeal on the stove. Her daughter's still asleep in the next room. The smell of cinnamon and morning. A world that no longer existed. Then the door slammed open. A sharp voice called out behind the desk. There was movement. Chair scraping. The rhythm of urgency. The officer spoke in low tones. Someone mentioned a call. Evelyn didn't hear the name, but she heard the change in energy. A name that meant something. Footsteps approached. Her cell door opened without warning. The officer who had brought her in now looked uneasy. He motioned for her to stand. She hesitated, unsure. He didn't explain. Just said, "You're being released." No apology. No paperwork. No explanation. Just a single sentence. Evelyn stood slowly. Her legs stiff. She stepped out of the cell, like someone waking from a dream they couldn't remember. A paper bag with her belongings was handed to her. Inside was the folder. Still slightly damp, but intact. They didn't give her a coat. They didn't ask if she had somewhere to go. Outside, the rain had stopped. The streets were still glistening. She walked slowly down the sidewalk, unsure of where she was even heading. The lights of the precinct faded behind her. Her shoes were soaked through, but she kept walking. She didn't feel free. She didn't feel safe. Just confused. Suspended in a world that no longer seemed to have rules. Far above, in an office with no nameplate on the door, the man in the suit watched her from a surveillance feed. She didn't know it, but someone had followed the squad car from the underpass. Recorded the moment she was cuffed. Tracked the arrest. His assistant stood silently behind him now, phone in hand, waiting for his next instruction. But the man said nothing for a while. Just watched. Then he spoke. Quietly. "Where did they take her folder?" The assistant replied, "She still has it." They handed it back to her. He nodded. Good. He didn't ask why she was arrested. He already knew. It didn't matter. The real question had already taken root in his mind. Why had a woman like Evelyn Carter, someone with decades of public service and a spotless record, ended up sleeping under a bridge in the rain, treated like a criminal for sitting still? The deeper he looked, the more the puzzle revealed itself. County budget cuts. A hospital that had quietly closed entire departments. A housing crisis with no names and no faces until now. But Evelyn had a face. And a name. And he wasn't going to forget it. Back on the street, Evelyn turned down a side alley where she knew she could shelter for a few hours. She didn't trust the city anymore, but the shadows at least were honest. She sat near the back wall, the folder resting on her knees again. Her hand hovered over it. She opened it slowly, smoothing the papers inside. She read the same line she had written dozens of times before. Seeking administrative support role. Experienced in records, scheduling, and community service. Strong work ethic. Reliable. Humble. She laughed softly. The kind of laugh that carries more sorrow than humor. Then she leaned back, pulled her coat tighter, and closed her eyes again. What she didn't know was that the story had already shifted. That someone had seen more than just a woman sitting in the rain. The man in the office was no longer watching the camera. He had begun making calls. To people with influence. To people who still remembered the meaning of dignity. To a woman he hadn't spoken to in years who once told him, "When you see injustice, don't write about it. Fix it." Evelyn thought the world had turned its back for good. But the world had just noticed her. And it was about to speak back. Morning came with the pale light of an overcast sky stretching over the rooftops like a blanket too thin for warmth. Evelyn woke slowly. Her back ached from the concrete, her hands stiff from the night air, but she didn't complain. She sat up, brushed her palms on her skirt, and stared for a while at the narrow alley that had kept her dry. No one had bothered her during the night. That alone felt like a small mercy. She gathered her things, which weren't many, and stood. It took a moment for her knees to cooperate. Hunger sat quietly inside her belly, like a familiar companion she'd stopped trying to silence. Still, she moved forward. That's what Evelyn did. She moved forward. A block away, at a small church that served hot oatmeal twice a week, she stood in line without saying a word. Others chatted around her, trading gossip or half-laughs about bad dreams and worse luck. Evelyn kept her eyes ahead. She accepted the paper bowl with quiet gratitude, sat near the farthest bench, and ate slowly, savoring every bite. Then she folded the spoon carefully, placed it back in the empty bowl, and stood again. Her dignity wasn't in the food she could or couldn't afford. It lived in how she held herself. She didn't know that across the city, the man in the black suit was preparing to see her in person. He had been through her file again that morning. Her certifications, her years of service, the awards that had never been displayed because Evelyn was never one for display. What struck him most wasn't her experience. It was the number of handwritten notes included in her last performance review. From nurses, from patients, from coworkers. Notes that said things like, "Miss Carter was the only one who stayed after hours when my mother was dying," or "She made me feel human when I didn't remember how to be." Those notes weren't part of the official file. Someone had added them, quietly, out of respect. He stepped into the back seat of his car and gave an address. Not to a company building, not to a meeting, to a diner. The same diner from 3 days before. When he walked in, the air changed again. The same waitress who had turned her back on Evelyn dropped her notepad. The young man who spilled the Coke was gone. The manager froze when she saw him. Her face blanched. She tried to smile, but it twisted like something unnatural. He didn't sit. He didn't order coffee. He only said one sentence. "Where is she?" The manager blinked. "Who, sir?" He didn't answer. He simply placed a paper on the counter. It was a copy of Evelyn's resume. At the top was the logo of his company, one of the largest property development firms in the state. The manager opened her mouth, closed it again. She didn't know what to say. The silence was punishment enough. He left without saying anything further. Outside, his driver was already turning the car around. He had somewhere else to be now. Evelyn had wandered toward the library. It had become her sanctuary. Warmth, bathrooms, sometimes even kindness. She sat at a computer she didn't know how to use well, typing slowly. She was trying again. One more job application. Maybe someone would see her name and not her circumstance. Maybe someone would believe she was still worth something. Then someone called her name. She looked up, confused. A woman stood there. A stranger in a crisp gray coat and calm eyes. "Miss Carter," she said softly. "I work with Mr. Raines. He's requested to meet you." Evelyn's heart beat harder. She clutched her bag tightly. "Why?" The woman didn't answer that. Only offered her hand. "He'd like to offer you something." Evelyn didn't move right away. Her life had taught her that offers often came with prices. But something in the woman's tone said this was different. So she stood. She followed. The car was black, sleek, too new for her to even recognize the make. The ride was quiet. She kept her eyes low, hands folded tightly. When they reached the office, she was led through a side entrance. No waiting room. No receptionist. Just a quiet hallway and a heavy wooden door that opened before she could knock. He stood as she entered. No introduction. No small talk. Just a kind smile and a soft voice that said, "Miss Carter, I believe I owe you an apology." And more than that, an opportunity. Evelyn stared. She didn't know what to say. She clutched her folder as if it might protect her. He continued. "I saw the way they treated you. At the diner. At the station. I saw the kindness you gave when no one was looking. The strength you showed when the world tried to break you. You've done more for this city in silence than most have done shouting for credit." Evelyn shook her head. "I don't want charity." He smiled again, gently. "This isn't charity. This is recognition. We're opening a new community center. We need someone to manage it. Someone organized. Someone who understands people. Someone who's lived. We'd like that someone to be you." Her mouth opened. Closed. Her throat tightened. "I haven't worked in months," she whispered. "I don't even have a phone." "We'll fix that," he said simply. "You've earned this, Miss Carter. Not because we feel sorry for you, but because the world needs more people like you in charge of something that matters." She sat down slowly. Her hands trembled. Not from fear. From something else. Hope. He handed her a folder. Inside was the job offer. Salary. Benefits. Housing support. A desk with her name already printed on a nameplate. He stood and walked to the window while she read. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "The ones who poured that Coke. The ones who looked away. We won't be working with them anymore." Evelyn looked up. Her eyes were glassy now, but she didn't let the tears fall. "I didn't ask for anything," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "That's why you deserve everything." She signed her name. The pen shook slightly in her grip. Outside, the city kept moving. Horns honked. Shoes clicked on sidewalks. No one knew that inside a quiet office, A woman who had been invisible for far too long had just been seen. Truly seen. And the world had started to change because of it. 1 month later, the morning sun spilled across the floor of a modest third-story apartment on the east side of the city. The curtains fluttered in the breeze from a cracked window, and the scent of cinnamon toast lingered in the air. Evelyn stood at the kitchen counter, pouring tea into a chipped white mug that had somehow survived all the moves, all the losses, all the nights, spent with nothing but silence for company. Now it sat beside a plate of scrambled eggs she had made for her son, Marcus, who sat at the table flipping through a math workbook. He had come back to her the week after the offer. Not immediately, not with a smile, but with hesitation and a suitcase that didn't have much in it. He didn't say much that first night, just lay down on the mattress and slept like someone who hadn't felt safe in years. Evelyn didn't ask where he had been. She didn't press, she simply laid a folded towel at the end of his bed, whispered good night, and let the healing begin in its own time. Now, he looked up from his workbook and grinned. "You made the eggs the way Dad used to." Evelyn smiled faintly, then turned away so he wouldn't see the tears that threatened to come. It had taken years to hear that tone in his voice again. Warmth, memory, trust. She didn't ruin it by speaking. She just sat across from him, wrapped her hands around her mug, and watched as her son slowly came back to life. Outside, the streets buzzed with the rhythm of a city waking up. People passed by the front of the new community center that had opened just 2 weeks earlier. The glass doors bore a simple brass plaque etched with her name, Evelyn Carter, Director. She hadn't wanted it at first. The title, the attention. But Mr. Raines insisted. He told her it wasn't about pride. It was about presence. People needed to know that someone who had once been forgotten was now leading a place designed for the forgotten. And they came slowly at first. A woman with 2 children who had fled an abusive home. A veteran who hadn't spoken more than 10 words in a year. A teenager who sat outside every day for 3 days before finally walking in and asking for help with homework. Evelyn remembered every face. She didn't rush them. She let them arrive in their own time, the same way the world had finally arrived for her. One afternoon, as she returned from a visit to the neighborhood shelter, a familiar face stood waiting outside the community center door. The manager from the diner. The one who had pointed her to the door like she was filth. She stood now holding a small brown envelope and a white cloth folded neatly in her other hand. Evelyn paused. She didn't feel anger, just something quiet and distant, like the shadow of a memory that no longer hurt the way it used to. The woman stepped forward slowly. "I found this," she said, holding out the cloth. "It's the napkin you dropped that day. I know it doesn't mean anything, but I am sorry. I didn't see you." Evelyn took the napkin gently. She didn't speak. The apology hung in the air like a fragile thing. Then she nodded once. That was enough. She turned and walked inside. Later that evening, Evelyn sat at her desk, sorting through a stack of handwritten suggestions from the youth program. One said, "Can we get more storybooks?" Another asked for an art room. She smiled as she read them. These were small things. But small things mattered. That's what she'd always believed. That a smile could be a turning point. That one person showing up could change the shape of someone's day. She remembered the woman at the bus stop who once handed her an apple without saying a word. She remembered a stranger holding the shelter door open without asking where she was going. She remembered giving her last clean scarf to a freezing woman who cursed at her before crying in her arms. All of it mattered. All of it had led here. She had never planned to be a symbol. But sometimes life picks the quiet ones, the tired ones, the ones who never ask, but always give. And now, children in the community called her Miss Evelyn. Elders waved when they passed the window. Even the grocery store cashier who once ignored her now greeted her with a soft, almost reverent smile. People had not just remembered her. They had come to respect her. Still, Evelyn hadn't changed. Not inside. She walked the same way, with calm steps and eyes that paid attention. She still handed out spare socks at the shelter. Still carried crackers in her purse for anyone who might need them. Every Friday, she cooked a big pot of stew in the center's tiny kitchen, enough for whoever wandered in without dinner. She never counted plates. She never turned anyone away. Because once not long ago she had been the one hoping someone would say, "Come in. Sit down. You belong here." That night, after the lights were turned off and the last child had been picked up, Evelyn walked home slowly. The city no longer felt hostile. It didn't feel soft either. But it was familiar. It was hers again. At the door to her building, a young woman she didn't recognize stopped her. "Are you the lady who helps people?" she asked. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "I try," she said. The girl reached into her bag and pulled out a wrinkled envelope. "I've been carrying this for days. I didn't know where to go. Someone told me about you." Evelyn took the envelope gently. "Let's talk inside," she said, and they did. The next morning, Evelyn placed a photo on her desk. It was of her family, taken years ago, before the losses, before the long winter of loneliness and rejection. She straightened the frame and whispered, "We're okay now." No one heard her. But the walls did. The kind of walls that remember kindness. The kind of space that holds both pain and redemption. The kind of place where people come not just to survive, but to begin again. And in the neighborhood, people no longer crossed the street to avoid her. They walked with her. Some just nodded. Some stopped to say thank you. Some brought fresh flowers for the lobby or books for the kids. Not because they were told to, but because they felt it. They had seen what could happen when a single woman decided not to give up, when she refused to believe the worst of herself, even when the world tried to convince her otherwise. And so Evelyn Carter lived each day not like a victory march, but like a quiet vow. To do for others what she wished someone had done for her. To keep the door open. To keep the lights on. To keep believing that even after the storm, something beautiful might still grow. One late afternoon, the sun dipped low behind the row of brick buildings, casting long golden shadows across the playground near the community center. Evelyn sat quietly on an old wooden bench, her hands resting in her lap as she watched the children run through puddles and patches of soft light. Their laughter echoed across the empty street like music, unfiltered and free. A small girl with a bright yellow jacket ran past her, then circled back and smiled. "Hi, Miss Evelyn," she said, then ran off again before Evelyn could reply. She smiled to herself and leaned back, the warmth of the moment folding over her like a gentle blanket. She no longer rushed through life. She let it come to her in stillness. A few minutes later, a young mother approached the bench, pushing a stroller and wearing the same nervous, uncertain look Evelyn had seen 100 times before. She slowed near the bench, hesitated, then gave a quiet nod. Evelyn nodded back. "You can sit if you want," she said. The woman smiled, almost grateful for the invitation. They didn't talk much, just shared a soft silence as their eyes followed the children. At one point the woman turned and said, "I heard what you did. For that girl with no place to go. Thank you." Evelyn only responded with a gentle hum, not brushing the compliment away, but letting it land softly without ceremony. She had never done anything for recognition. She had done it because someone needed to, and she was someone. That night, Evelyn returned home just as the streetlights began to flicker on. Marcus was already inside, his books spread across the kitchen table, a pencil behind his ear. He looked up when she came in, offered a shy smile, then turned back to his studies. The apartment was warm, filled with the smell of rice cooking on the stove. A far cry from the nights under bridges, from the rain-soaked alleyways and empty shelters. She poured a glass of water, leaned on the counter, and took a moment just to breathe. She didn't take any of it for granted. Every corner of the home held a reminder of what had been lost and what had been rebuilt. In the quiet that followed dinner, Evelyn sat in the living room and opened a small box that had arrived earlier that week. Inside was a letter, written by hand, from someone she hadn't spoken to in years. It was from the daughter who had moved away, the one Evelyn thought might never return. The letter was short, but filled with words Evelyn had longed to hear. "Mom, I saw your story. A friend sent me the article. I cried. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I'm proud of you. I love you. I'm coming to visit next month if you'll have me." Evelyn folded the letter slowly, pressed it to her chest, and closed her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly, not from pain, but from the ache of joy returning. The next morning, she woke early and walked to the community center before sunrise. She unlocked the front door herself, turned on the lights, opened the windows, and stood in the middle of the lobby as the dawn light poured in. On the wall to her left hung a photo someone had taken weeks earlier. In it, she was smiling as she handed a small backpack to a young boy. Behind her, the painted mural read, "This is a place where people matter." She hadn't noticed the photo being taken, but someone had framed it, and now it hung without words or labels, just quiet honor. On the opposite wall, a new edition had appeared, a plaque, gifted anonymously, that simply read, to the woman who refused to disappear. Evelyn had asked them not to make a big deal of it, but they insisted, not for her ego, but for the reminder it would give to anyone who walked through the door feeling unseen. By noon, the center was buzzing again. Volunteers carried boxes of supplies. A group of seniors played cards near the window. Children practiced spelling words with chalk on the sidewalk. Evelyn moved through them all with steady grace. She knew every name. She asked about homework, about doctors' visits, about grandmothers and missing pets. She listened the way people rarely do anymore, with both ears and heart. Later that week, a reporter visited. They wanted to write about her, do a video segment, maybe even get her on camera. Evelyn declined. She said the story wasn't hers alone. It belonged to the people who helped her, the ones who stayed kind when it cost them nothing, and especially the ones who stayed kind when it cost them everything. The reporter asked what kept her going. She answered without needing to think. Because I know what it feels like to be forgotten. And I know what it feels like to be remembered. I want more people to feel the second thing. When she walked home that evening, the sky had turned pink and gold. At the corner of the block, a boy she'd once helped find shelter was playing a song on a secondhand guitar. He saw her, paused, then strummed a soft tune just for her. She didn't recognize it, but it didn't matter. It was beautiful. She passed the old diner, now under new management, and caught a glimpse of herself in the glass. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman in the reflection. The calm posture, the quiet strength, the eyes that had seen too much but still looked gently at the world. Then she smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because she had survived. She had lived through the unraveling and somehow, impossibly, had woven it all into something whole again. A few weeks later, the city council unveiled a new mural on the wall of the community playground. At the center of it, painted in soft tones, was a faceless woman in a long white dress, standing with her arms open and children at her side. There was no plaque, no name, but everyone knew who it was meant to be. Evelyn stood in the back of the small crowd, unnoticed by most, and watched the ceremony without speaking. She didn't need to stand in the front. Her place had never been about spotlight. It had always been about presence. As the crowd dispersed, a little boy tugged on her sleeve. "Are you the lady in the painting?" She looked down at him and smiled. "I'm just someone who believes people deserve a second chance." He nodded like that made perfect sense, then ran off to play. That night, she sat by her window with a cup of tea and a notebook. She wrote slowly, not a journal, not a speech, just a letter to the version of herself who had once believed it was over. She wrote, "You were wrong. It wasn't over. It was only just beginning." She didn't need to send it. She just needed to know she had said it. And across the city, in places where no one knew her name, people were helping strangers, holding doors, offering meals, all inspired by a story they'd heard about a woman who had once been arrested under a bridge, but had walked out into the light, not for revenge, but to keep others warm. Evelyn never called herself a hero. She just kept showing up, and the world, slowly, quietly, had begun to show up with her. A week later, Evelyn returned to that same bench by the playground. The trees had begun to shift into early autumn colors, and the wind carried the smell of leaves and laughter. She wore a soft blue sweater someone at the center had gifted her, saying it looked like peace. Around her, children chased one another, their shoes thudding rhythmically against the pavement. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. Her presence had become its own kind of message, steady, warm, a reminder that not all stories end where they fall apart. A young woman approached, not more than 20, clutching a thin notebook and walking like the ground might vanish beneath her feet. She looked at Evelyn with trembling eyes. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Evelyn tilted her head, gently took the notebook from her hands, and said softly, "If you're still standing, then you already are." She had become more than a director, more than a survivor. She had become something cities rarely know how to name: a quiet beacon, not burning bright to demand attention, but glowing gently to guide the lost home. And now, if you've made it this far in the story, I'd like to ask something of you. Not for Evelyn. Not for us. For the next Evelyn. The one who's walking through your city right now, with worn shoes and tired hands. The one who's sitting quietly on a park bench, holding a folder no one wants to read. The one who picks up a dropped phone for someone who doesn't say thank you. Look for her. Notice her. Choose kindness. Choose to believe that even the smallest act of dignity can echo further than you'll ever know. And if this story moved you, if you felt something stir in your heart, help us keep telling stories like this. Subscribe to Cracks of Light. Leave us a comment. Share this story with someone who might need it today. Your voice, your support, your presence, it all matters. Because the world doesn't change all at once. It changes when we notice someone, when we listen, when we refuse to look away. Thank you for being here. And until next time, stay kind, stay human. And remember, even in the darkest corners, there is always a crack, and through it, light can still get in.